Right, welcome to this second session in this track. I have the pleasure of introducing Amelia Andersdotter and Anders Jensen Hurstad. We'll talk about data protection for websites and so please
Very good, thank you for this warm welcome. My name is Amelia Andersdotter and this is Anders Jensen Hurstad. We work together in an organization called Dataskydd.net, which was originally created in 2012 as a way of informing the Swedish public in the Swedish language about the European data protection reform. I will start this talk by talking a bit about what privacy is, why it's important, why me and Anders et al. Dedicate ourselves to data protection. Then I will go on to talk a bit about the regulatory framework and the values that are enshrined in it. I will also very briefly mention what data protection is not, and in particular that data protection is not equivalent to data security, even though they are very often conflated. And then I will introduce a project that me and Anders have been running with municipal websites in Sweden, which will serve as an introduction to Anders' later part of the presentation with simple to use measures that everyone can deploy at their websites in order to ensure that they respect the privacy and data protection rights of the people that visit the website. So privacy is one of the cornerstones of our human rights schemata in Europe. Human rights is something that we use in order to codify the relations between individuals and people who exercise power over individuals. We have this quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I believe we never verified, but that we found in a Council of Europe report written by a Dutch Christian Democrat in the spring, which says, "Our freedom is built on what others do not know of our existences." We face huge challenges in the online environment today because very often data trails that we leave around ourselves online help others find out things about our existence that we don't know ourselves. For this reason, data protection is accentuated. The need for data protection is accentuated in modern IT environments. And part of the reason that we care about the data protection reform of the European Union is because it will be our procedural tool to ensure that we can continue to guarantee our freedom as individuals and our autonomy to make choices, even when we are surrounded by these tools. So, data protection and the right to privacy is also enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights. Many of you will be familiar with the existence of the convention. It came about in the 1950s after the Second World War. And one of the peculiarities of the European Convention of Human Rights is that it does not apply to citizens. If a state has signed the European Convention, it does not get obligations only with respect to its own citizens. It also gets obligations with regards to every other person who is on the territory of that state. So the European Convention doesn't distinguish between whether you're Swedish or Danish or Moroccan or a United States citizen. As long as you're on Swedish territory, the Swedish government, by virtue of its signature, needs to respect the human rights. The European Court of Human Rights, which is responsible for maintaining the Convention, has also given a relatively broad definition to privacy and the right to private life. So, for instance, while the Swedish legislative framework would normally only protect you against especially egregious infringements on personal rights committed by the government, the European Convention, the court says, protects more the identity of an individual. So our ability to control who we are and who we will become, and understand who is trying to influence our choices and in what way, and also give our consent to whether we want to be subjected to such influence. Now, data protection is very frequently conflated with data security, and so for this reason I want to start relatively early by saying that they are not the same thing. Data security is having a system that performs the activities which you foresaw. You can have a privacy infringing system that works. Intuitively, this makes sense. You design the system to infringe on somebody's privacy and still it functions. That would make it secure because it does what it was supposed to in the way which was foreseen. Data protection goes beyond that. Data protection is also a collection of tools which places the security of the individual at the center of the design or at the center of the system. Data protection means simply that we are guarding our rights to determine who we are and to determine who we will become and who is trying to subject us to influence in this process. The European Data Protection Framework is an implementing tool of data protection. The same thing as Sweden, personuppgiftslagen. I'm sure many local people here will know about the personuppgiftslagen. It's the tool we use to implement privacy rights and data protection. It's really nothing but a procedure, and it contains a few very nice, easy principles at its heart. These particular principles are collected from the European Data Protection Reform, so they might not be, there is not a 100% overlap with the old framework, only to say. So first of all, you have the right to know. In order to exercise power over something as an individual, you need to be aware of what it is that you're trying to exercise influence or power over. In order to say no to somebody influencing you, you need to be aware, you need to have information. In order to object to a particular security problem, you have to understand that the security problem can exist, or that it has existed, or that it affected you somehow. So the right to know, and the right for each individual to know how data processing or collection or profiling or measurements of their being is extremely central for data protection working as a tool. Now, we also have the right to consent, which is a consequence of having the right to know. If you're aware of something being wrong, you may want to have the right to object to it. If you feel uncomfortable with a particular activity undertaken against you, you will want to say no, and therefore in the legislation, the right to consent is a very fundamental part. We're trying to make it so that the legislation, at least at the European level, is user-centric. This is especially not reflected in the Swedish legislation, where data protection traditionally has been government-centric. Because traditionally we see computer systems as far too difficult for individuals to understand, in many cases we have robbed individuals of both the right to know and the right to consent, because we don't consider them capable of assessing what a computer actually does. User-centrism would mean the exact opposite, and has been codified in at least the European Commission proposal for a data protection legislation, which is that users can make the right decisions given the right information. And I think we also have a lot of indications that this is the case. Many people that use iPhones use the option to send an empty phone book. We know that individuals who are aware of the implications of their actions and that are given simple choices to avoid negative impacts actually do them. So user-centrism is very important. Now, data minimization means you don't store or keep or collect more information than you actually need. Data protection, data minimization, again, is an important tool of both data security and data protection, because you can't profile somebody based on knowledge you don't have. But additionally, you also can't have security problems surrounding data that you didn't collect. In order for you to leak a lot of data or to lose a lot of data about somebody, you need to have it in the first place. So data minimization is one of these very important and fundamental principles of the European Commission proposal that safeguards actually both data security and data protection at the same time. One additional measure that the Commission proposed in 2012 was effective sanctions against entities that do things wrong. This has hitherto been missing. So for instance, it could be the case in the past that if a large company committed some form of privacy error, which affected negatively on individuals in the European Union, they would get something like 20,000 euros in a fine, which for most multinational companies today isn't actually much. They could lose that amount of money on a daily basis and still not suffer any consequences for their affairs. One of the places where we still have problems with the Commission proposal, but mostly in member state law, is that we lack, and this is especially noteworthy in Sweden, that we lack methods for individuals to hold public authorities accountable for data processing that they do. So what me and Anders did when we were thinking about how do we raise these issues in a larger public context, like what is the good place to start when you want to discuss data protection and change infrastructures, and especially with online tracking and safeguarding personalities therein, who would you first turn to in order to have as effective a campaign as possible? And we turned to public websites. Municipal websites in particular. This is because municipalities don't have an inherent interest to track and trace people. They don't live off of advertisement money, they live off of tax money. So there is no commercial incentive for the municipality to track anyone who visits their website. Also, we have many municipalities in Sweden that invest a lot in new IT solutions. So it makes sense to try and reach into that area and ensure that they make the right investments also to protect the fundamental rights of people who visit them. At the core of our analysis was the idea that you can visit the public website privately. While you have the right to know that you're visiting the municipality doesn't necessarily have the right to know that you've visited it. And also the municipality doesn't need to know. We don't need to disclose to third parties that we've looked up information about where our local kindergartens are located, and so is this information presently being collected, and if so, why is it being collected, and is there anything simple that can be done to stop that? We have some overarching problems, of course, with the public sector, which is that very frequently they don't make deliberate decisions about IT. They are passive recipients of marketing, and they buy a lot of solutions wholesale. And this is a challenge because it means a lot of the questions about the inherent relationship between municipalities and citizens that should exist don't arise in the way that municipalities make IT decisions. We've tried to focus our work in such a way that it becomes more obvious for municipalities making these decisions that this is the case. We also have the problem of IT often being deployed as a means of governing the population more easily rather than as a means for enabling the population to interact with government or local government. So very frequently the idea behind a particular e-government solution, including a website for a municipality, is to facilitate the work of the administration rather than to facilitate the citizens' empowerment inside that administration. So these are some overarching challenges that one will find, almost regardless of what one did actually with data protection in the public sector. And we picked websites because it's an easy target, but you of course have a host of other problems also in the e-identification of the services, forms that need to be filled in, and so forth. Applications for high school has been one frequently cited example in Swedish studies about this. When we tracked Swedish municipality websites, we found that 99%, actually more than 99% of them use either third-party trackers, tracking cookies, or third-party services that track somehow the behavior of individuals that visit the site. Only 2 municipalities out of 290 did not subject visitors to any form of third-party tracking that was non-consensual at all. This was 2 more than I expected to find, so I'm not entirely unhappy with this result. And in fact, it's quite spectacular that 2 municipalities, in spite of the huge marketing that is around tracking right now and the benefits of tracking, are able to make this. We've been in touch with both of the municipalities, and it also turns out that in the cases where municipalities do things right, it's normally because there's been one ambitious individual who had some amount of thought when he implemented the system. So it really takes very little effort to become green in this chart, and still so few municipalities have accomplished it. There's also, in my view, somehow a developer problem here that the people who sell the services to the municipalities somehow feel entitled to get information about visitors so that they can improve themselves, as if other people that visit the municipality automatically have the obligation to help web developers with their work. But apparently, at least in some cases, people don't. One of the municipalities was especially cool because the guy who made them green was only a half-time employee doing a consultancy. So that should in itself indicate that it's not super difficult to become privacy protecting, at least insofar as concerns setting up a municipal website. I will not talk too much about the European Union law because I think the 5 principles that I already went over, they're very sufficient, and if you keep them in mind, right to consent, right to know, user centrism, data minimizations, already you'll be safe. Most of these laws codify exceptions. So what do you do when you don't want somebody to know what you do? What do you do when you don't want to provide somebody with the ability to consent? What would you do if you want to collect more data than you need? And what do you want to do when you want to put yourself rather than the user at the center? Well, if you didn't want to do any of those things, you would go to one of these laws and you would check, is there an exception under which I fall? I put them in here for reference. We will also put them online, so if you want to go exception hunting later, you will be able to find them. But I will not go too much into the details of them here. And of course, the principles that I recounted are from the General Data Protection Regulation, which is still under negotiation. And yeah, so that was it. I think that covers my end of this my end of this talk, and we will now move over to more technical implementing things, including advice that we've provided to municipalities over the course of the past year as we've acquired a larger interest in our data protection activities. I will hand over to Anders.
Great. So there are many things you can do to become more protective of data. The two principles you can start with is encrypt always, and don't tell other people about your visitors, at least not without consent. So like, for example, HTTPS is important not just for banking or checking email. It could be that the mere fact that you're visiting a certain page is in itself sensitive. And if you use plain old HTTP and visit a page like this, Söderberget, one of the largest hospitals in Sweden, page about HIV, they don't use HTTPS, so anyone with access to the traffic can of course see exactly what you're visiting and what page you're on. It's like a bunch of postcards going back and forth, and so anyone between you and the hospital website can see this. This could be your employer, your school, maybe you have someone in your household. Anyone who managed to Google to install a packet center, which is not really rocket science. Had they used HTTPS, this is all the attack would have seen. All the HTTP headers are encrypted, and the only thing visible really is the server name, which is sent as part of the TLS handshake. And this is not perfect privacy, because you can still do some kind of traffic analysis attack, but it's a magnitude better than unencrypted. Unfortunately, the SSL certificate business has been a racket for a long time, but have become cheaper, and very soon now, Let's Encrypt will finally set them free, which is super cool, and then no one has any excuse anymore. If you do use HTTPS, you should, I encourage you to go on HSTS, which is Strict Transport Security, which is basically just your server telling the user's browser to only communicate through HTTPS for a given amount of time. This protects against some man-in-the-middle attacks. Here's another example. So you saw Grenska, the largest hospital in Northern Europe. They do use HTTPS by default, which is cool. And this third page about HIV. And of course they have the obligatory social media presence. So you scroll down and this thing called referrers. So whenever you click on a link, typically, your browser will happily tell the other websites exactly where you're coming from, the full URL. So if you click on Facebook, the link to the Facebook page, your browser will tell Facebook that you're just reading a page about HIV. Which is, you might not want Facebook to know this, yes, or Twitter or LinkedIn. There are ways to avoid this these days, though. HTML5 introduced the no refer link type. So you basically just add really no refer to your link, and this tells the browser not to send refer information when the link is clicked. And this is an official recommendation, supported by practical all browsers, so I think. But it's a bit cumbersome because you have to add this to each and every link, and it doesn't apply to, what about other things that send refers, like external CSS or JS or images or fonts? Turns out there is another much cooler development called refer policy. This lets you specify a policy that applies to all the links clicked on the page, as well as all the resources, as well as all the requests generated by the page. So everything's pulled in, all the files. And there are different policies. The most strict is no refer or never, which tells the browser to not send any refer information whatsoever. And this is actually supported by all the major browsers except Explorer. Although it is supported by the Windows 10 browser, which is nice. So with this one single line, you can improve privacy a little bit today. I encourage you to do this. Okay, so you got your certificate and you kill your refers. Next up are all the third-party things that one might use. We found that the vast majority of Swedish municipalities, as well as most Swedish government agencies, use Google Analytics. And you might not want your government to tell Google about all your business to the government. It should be like interaction between you and government, and not third party, which you don't give consent to, or have the ability to consent to. Of course, Google Analytics is very useful, but there are alternatives. The prime one being eWeek, which is very much like Google Analytics, but it's free software, GPL. You run it yourself on your own server, and then you are in possession of the data. And it has a bunch of privacy options, like you can anonymize IPs, and you can choose how much you want to anonymize them. You can remove detailed visitor logs after X amount of days. It respects to track by default. And unlike Google Analytics, it can be used without cookies. The stats become a bit less precise and you lose some functionality, but still very useful. And of course also the option that I try to remind people of, that you don't actually have to track people just because you can. I don't know. Common platforms like Discuss and Facebook embedded comments and things like this are also a little evil. Discuss, for example, which is used by they don't allow anonymous comments. They are in possession of all your comments, and they claim extremely broad and perpetual irrevocable rights to your comments forever. And yeah, and they sell user data to various companies for various reasons. But there are things you can do instead. If you use something like WordPress or Drupal, you might use the old built-in comment system, or you can use a self-hosted one that's like a Discuss clone, like ISO, which I think is Python, and Hashover, which is PHP. Or if you have like a bigger website, you might have something like Vanilla Forms or Discourse, which both have plugins to integrate with CMSs to use them for comments. Social media buttons, as I guess most of you know, are also a little bit about tracking. So one should avoid using the vendor-provided embed codes, and you could use like a local host image or font awesome icon font and use it, construct links yourself. Or you can maybe use like this nice two-click solution that I found on the blog of Bruce Schneier, where the social media stuff is inactive when you load a page. So you have to actively click, toggle switch, and not until then does actually send anything to Facebook or Twitter. So you have to actually opt in to be tracked, which is nice. I think it's called social privacy. Yeah, you can easily Google this, or I can tell you afterwards. Fonts. Google Fonts is very, very useful, but again, you're telling someone else about your visitors. This is a page about suicide prevention that's happened. They did use HTTPS, but they also used Google Fonts. And of course, the center refer header telling Google that I was just listing a suicide prevention website. You could easily self-host fonts too. There are tools that will take a given font from Google Fonts and download all the font formats and generate the proper CSS. Or you could use, at least use the meta refer thing from before, which would avoid this. So, there are many things you can do, but these are some good starting things, I think. So, always use encryption and check out the Let's Encrypt project. Don't, kill all your referrers. That's also very easy. It's one line change addition. And don't load third-party stuff without consent. Most things can actually be self-hosted. It's not without too many complications.
Right. So we've seen a number of examples of privacy infringements that occur in the healthcare sector that Anders has tracked down. Now it's important to know that the reason that this information should not be leaked is not only because a private person might feel uncomfortable with the fact that somebody finds out that they're visiting suicide prevention sites or websites informing them about sexually transmitted diseases, but also because these visits can have a real and concrete impact on the individual that lies beyond the individual's control, such as, for instance, in their interaction with private healthcare companies, insurance companies, or even it can have an influence now on their friends, because very frequently a lot of companies that do employment or insurance or well, financial sectors or even public institutions profile you based on your social circles and what kind of behavior is expected from the social circles in which you are. Many privacy threats, or the reason we have data protection, are a bit abstract in the way that we're not looking to prevent necessarily any direct harms to consumers or private citizens directly following the privacy infringing action. We're talking about long-term consequences for entire communities and in general at the end for society in itself. So we want to conclude with individuals matter. Society is constituted by individuals, and individual rights matter not only for unique individuals but also for society as a whole. Data protection is one right where this is especially obvious and where the failure to uphold the right has grave consequences, not only for individuals in individual consequences in individual circumstances, but also for society as a whole and for groups of individuals in various contexts. It's also possible to protect privacy. Many of the technical measures that we've detected, they're not super difficult to do, actually. The only thing that is required is that somebody thinks about doing them when it's appropriate to think about it. We would also like you to join us in this quest to spread more data protection around society. You can, for instance, contact your municipality and ask how they are not tracking people at their website and why they are not using these simple methods of doing it better. If they aren't doing it. If you live in either Sävsjö or Storfors in Sweden, you wouldn't have to do that because they're the two municipalities that already did well. So, but basically if you live anywhere else, those questions could be justifiably put to the IT department in a nice way, and I think a lot of municipalities presently aren't doing this simply because they're not aware of how easy it is. With that, we'd like to open for questions. If anyone has any questions, thank you.
So let's thank the speakers first. So I have a question. On your homepage, is there, I guess this information is readily available in some format that you can sort of be inspired to use in your communication with your municipalities?
Sure, we publish every presentation that we make on, it's in one of the menus.
This one isn't up yet.
This one isn't up yet, but we have 3 others, I think, two?
Yeah, two.
Yeah, at least 2 others that we've already made, and they're very similar. One that we did in Sevilla with the WordPress community in the summer, and also we visited the Drupal conference in August. And you will find them in one of the drop-down menus that is either called Actions or Info. Yeah. I think the main site is in Swedish now, so if you're not a Swedish speaker, it might be slightly more difficult to navigate. But it's generally available, yes.
Maybe you should add one of these Google Translate plugins.
Yes. We will consult.
Well, probably our residents generally know how to do it themselves.
What?
Google Translate.
Oh.
Copying URL and things like this.
Any other questions?
I have a kind of a tip, maybe related to this concerning HTTPS. I discovered this Firefox plugin which switches on HTTPS everywhere where it's available. That's a good thing to use to hide your communication as a user. It will call HTTPS everywhere. Just a tip for the audience.
Yeah. I think our work is we're trying to make people not have to protect themselves against their own government, for example. But I use that plugin too.
Well, if there are no more questions, I guess you can probably ask Anders and Amelia questions yourselves. Otherwise, we'll take an early lunch. Lunch is served in the cafe.